Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Artur Gruszczak. I'm the chairman of the organizing committee, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the fourth Jagiellonian Interdisciplinary Conference held in Kraków. It's the fourth edition. And I'm really happy to host you here and to give a brief introductory speech. I would like to welcome our dean, Professor Piotr Bajor, and before I will ask the dean to formally open this event, this conference, let me just give you a few words about the very idea behind Jagiellonian Interdisciplinary Security Conferences. Essentially, this conference is organized by the Department of National Security, being part of the Institute of International Relations and Political Studies, which belongs in the Faculty of International and Political Studies. So security has been our area of specialty, of research, didactic, teaching, having BA and MA programs in security, in national security, but also containing elements of international security, strategic studies. So security was the main area of our activities for years. And it was the area where we started to look for some new innovative elements. Interdisciplinary, because we see security in a wider context, connected to or linked to, let's say, neighboring disciplines like international relations, political science, law, sociology to some extent. So the idea behind the first conference, which was launched in the year 2015, was to take security in a truly interdisciplinary way and to gather scholars who would like to look at security from different angles and to work out a sort of synergy, something which adds up to what we conventionally thought or reflected as security area. So the first conference in 2015 was dedicated to cross-disciplinary approaches to security in the changing world, in the changing environment. While the mid-2010s were plenty of processes and phenomena that needed to see, to observe them from different angles. It was the crisis in Europe, migration crisis. It was, the situation in Ukraine after the first stage of Russian aggression. It was the situation in the ongoing conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, etc. So that was our motivation to reflect on that from cross-disciplinary perspective. The second one in 2018 was dedicated to activeness in security, reassessing this activeness in times of global order, rather disorder, and to see security actors as friends, foes, and familiar strangers. and this changing roles and also some well-established functions were inspiration to the second conference. The third one, in 2021, it was in times of pandemic. So we had it online and was devoted to innovative governance. Well, the COVID pandemic, anyway, brought about many innovations, right? It forced us to be innovative in online teaching, in distant learning, etc., etc. So it was yet another interesting experience and I think contribution to general reflection on security, looking closely to governance and organization of security structures, institutions in the time of the pandemic. Well, this year the conference is taking up the challenge of interdisciplinarity in security studies from the perspective of great powers. Great powers game, their competition, rivalry, also engagement in different forms of conflict, tension, competition, as I say, rivalry, even wars. So that was yet another global topic, global dilemma that really deserves our attention. To see how powers strive at defying the existing order, revising it, maybe sometimes striking back as being empires. And I think and I trust that this, as a guiding topic, will be well represented and present in papers that are going to be presented during the conference. And I believe it will be also present in our keynote lecture. So I hope and I believe that this year the Jagiellonian Interdisciplinary Security Conference will be a really nice forum for lively, stimulating, and interdisciplinary debate on the whole spectrum of security-related themes, problems, and fields which stretch between war and peace. Well, before I will give the floor to our Dean, Professor Bayor, let me thank to those who contributed to the organization and this event. Firstly, to the faculty authorities, especially Dean, the former Dean, and present Dean, the former Dean, Professor Leider, who unfortunately could not attend because of other duties. Now, as a vice director for education, so I would like to pass all my let's say tribute and thanks to acting Dean Professor Piotr Bayor. I would also like to thank especially to Professor Magdalena Góra, who is the project leader of Future Democracy Lab, which supported organization of this conference and also contributed with some ideas behind some parts of the conference, especially the experts panel. And I would also like to thank very much to the director of the Institute of Political Science and International Relations, Professor Adrian Tyszkiewicz, who also helped to co-finance this event. Of course, the organization committee that I have a privilege to chair did an enormous job to coordinate all the preparatory work and also to be present in the course of the conference, to chair and moderate discussion in the panels. So thank you very much, all of you, for your efforts, and I hope this will be absolutely tremendous to see the final outcomes of this conference. And last but not least, I would like to thank our volunteers, our students who are in the reception desk, and who will be also also your assistants during the conference in the rooms where the panels will take place. You can count on their help if needed. All right, so now I would like to pass the floor to Professor Piotr Pajor. Piotr, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Gruszczak. Dear professors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure, honor for me to be with you today and officially open this prestigious conference. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be with us today and to join to this scientific event. On behalf of Faculty of International and Political Studies, let me once again welcome all of you here in the building of faculty at Jagiellonian University in Kraków, at the Jagiellonian Interdisciplinary International Security Conference, which for me and for faculty is extremely important event for several reasons. Professor Gruszczak mentioned and explained the whole idea behind the organization of this conference, which started almost 10 years ago. So I will not talk in the details about the conference again. But for me, it's also the symbolic event today, because I was also the member, the organizing committee for years, and once again, for your invitation. And I'm very happy that I can be today with you as a dean of our faculty. Firstly, this conference for me and for faculty is very important event as a platform for scientific cooperation and scientific discussion about very important issues connected with international security, international relations seen from a security perspective, and from this interdisciplinary perspective. This perspective is very important, and let me thank you very much also that you decided to accept our invitation to come to Kraków and present your research results, your findings in the framework of our conference during the very interesting panels and very interesting topics which will be discussed today and tomorrow at our faculty. Secondly, this event, this conference is also very important in implementation of our policy to strengthen our cooperation with external partners. I mean, universities, of course, from Poland and from abroad, but also NGOs, think tanks. I see that we have the representatives from various organizations. Yeah, I'm very happy because I'm sure, as the previous conference showed us, that this conference will also bring new projects, new publications, and new ideas of the cooperation regarding international security. So once again, thanks that you are here and we can have opportunity to seriously talk and seriously discuss very important issues devoted to international security. I looked through the program, and let me congratulate Professor Gruszczak and all your team with preparation such interesting event, but I would like to also underline the participation of our students. Engagement of students in the research process is also one of our priorities, the faculty, not only in the framework of strategic program excellence initiative, but day by day as a policy of our faculty. So I'm also very grateful that this conference is also the platform for implementation such policy and real involvement students in the research process. So once again, I would like to congratulate it. We are lucky, not only because we can see today and we can, develop our cooperation, but we are lucky about the weather in Kraków, because we have a beautiful weather in Kraków. And despite of the conference, I also encourage you to have the walk in the Kraków, familiarize with our beautiful university city, and come back to your universities, to your home, with great, nice memories from our faculty, from our university, but also from our city, Kraków. Of course, events like a conference, projects, such activities need the team, the people, the responsible people who can implement such idea like organizing the international conference. So on the behalf of the faculty, I would like to thank you, Professor Artur Gruszczak and your team for organizing this conference, for all your work done in last months, preparing this very important conference. Professor Gruszczak, we are very grateful as a faculty, and I'm very grateful that we always can count on you, on your team. Artur, thank you very much. Last but not least, I would like to finally officially open today's conference. And once again, thank you that you accepted our invitation, and would like to wish you a fruitful discussion and successful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you, Dean. Well, before we will go to the main part of this first session, I mean the keynote lecture, let me just share a handful of practical information. Well, coffee, tea, water, some sweets are served in close proximity to this aula, and they will be served as well as lunch. Today and tomorrow they will be in the same place. So this is important because the rooms for panels will be located on the first floor. So during the coffee breaks or lunch break, please go down and find a proper place to enjoy coffee break or lunches. When it comes to our gala dinner today evening, it is located in the Old Town, so it's not a big distance from here. I think that you are familiar with our conference guides. There are maps that show the best way. It's a walking distance, I think, like 15 minutes from here by walk. Well, there is also an option to get there via the public transport. However, it's a bit, I think, complicated because we are talking about the Old Town area, which is actually excluded from the traffic. I think that if you would like to go in a group together, so we can meet at 6:30 and go there with, well, as I said, with a guide. One of our colleagues from the organization committee will be your guide. Okay. Okay, so now I would like to give the floor to Professor Beatrice Heuser, and most of all, I would like to thank very much to Beatrice for accepting this invitation and to be a keynote speaker. Well, just introduce our honorable keynote speaker. Professor Beatrice Heuser is internationally renowned scholar, doing research in war studies and strategic studies. She's professor of international relations at the School of Social and Political Science of the University of Glasgow, and also she works in Germany, the Bundeswehr's school, and she cooperated with numerous research institutions, such as RUSI, United Service Institute, Chatham House, French Institute of International Affairs, and she's a prolific author. She has published many important books, including War, a genealogy of Western ideas and practices, published by Oxford University Press 2 years ago. So The Evolution of Strategy, Thinking War from Antiquity to the Present, The Strategy Makers, Thoughts on War and Society from Machiavelli to Clausewitz, and Reading Clausewitz, which is one of the most stimulating and most refreshing reflection on this great German military thinker. So again, I'm really delighted to have Beatrice Heuser as our keynote lecturer, and I would like to pass the floor to Professor Heuser for her lecture, which will be also supported by PowerPoint presentation.
One, two, three. Okay. Yeah. Super. Okay. Dear Dean, dear faculty leadership, dear Arthur, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very honored to be here at your fantastic and old university. And I am starting straight away with the central subject, surely, of this whole conference, namely the war in the warring states, the age of warring states. So let me go to the question of how to debate war and peace, how to define war and peace. And I have a structure for you. It's going to be covering 5 points of unequal length, and want to start straight away with a question to you, because you're also the experts on international relations. Do you believe that war or peace should be seen as the norm in international relations? Could I have a show of hands for those of you who think that war is the norm? Okay, thank you. Can I have a show of hands of those who think that peace is the norm? About equal, very interesting, and let me furnish some evidence or some arguments to both sides. I like this quotation from Sir Henry Sumner Maine, who said, war seems to be as old as mankind, peace a modern invention. I wouldn't quite go that far. There is ample evidence, if you look at anthropology and things like that, that people, when the world was populated very thinly, would have tended to cooperate rather than necessarily to war. But if there's a shortage of resources, perhaps it's the other way around. But let's not go into the actual, the evidence of it, but let's look at the two arguments. And what I would like to underscore, I think it's very, very important, is that both traditions, the tradition of arguing that war is the norm and the tradition of arguing that peace is the norm, or also the practice of both, have been there throughout Western history, by which I just mean European plus sort of American. Interestingly, we find a lovely contradiction in Plato, who on the one hand said that all city-states were always at war really with each other, but then at the same time, or somewhere else, says that you should legislate for a default situation of peace rather than for a default situation of war. Very interestingly, Rome has both traditions. You had a very long tradition of the Temple of Janus, i.e. war, being there all the time, very, very often. When Augustus, who created the Principate, wrote his own testament or his own marks of achievement, he said he was very proud of the fact that in his own reign, the Temple of Janus had been closed a few times, which again says not normally, but a few times, of which he was very proud, and that he was hoping that this would go on. But of course, he created an idea that has been with us ever since, the Pax Romana, the idea that peace should be the norm. So that's really, in some respects, the Roman Empire. In the early Middle Ages in Europe, war was practically an annual thing because it was an economic enterprise. It was an economic enterprise to find booty and to pay oneself by going and despoiling others. And if you look at peace treaties, you find something very interesting in the European tradition, which is that only from 1500 do you have a tradition of perpetual peace written into peace treaties. Before that, peace treaties tended to be of limited duration. Before that, peace treaties were concluded for 20 years or a generation or something like that. And even in medieval times, when one of the parties signatory to a peace treaty died, i.e. it was normally kings, then the peace treaty had to be renewed by their heir. It was not automatic that it was renewed. So it's only from 1500 that this idea of perpetual peace as an aim comes up, which is fascinating. In the 19th century, the century of realism, where people assumed that everybody was out to get everybody else and everybody was at war with everybody else, you have this whole tradition of the proto-racists, particularly coming out of Germany, always underscoring that war, that the contests of different nations is the norm. And of course, this whole idea got a lot of strength with social Darwinism. I use the term advisedly, you know, that we don't assume that Darwin thought that this is what sociologists made of Darwin's ideas, so Darwinism rather than Darwinian thinking. And throughout Europe, you had, particularly in the 19th century, this idea that war was the norm and you couldn't possibly trust anybody else. And this, of course, goes on directly, this feeds directly into the realist tradition of Carl Schmitt. For some reason that I don't understand, Carl Schmitt is much beloved in France these days. Whenever I go to a French conference, they quote Carl Schmitt, and every time I go, oh my God, how can you quote this horrible Nazi? So beware of thinking that this is a good thing to quote, but be aware, of course, of his ideas. At the same time, you had also from the 19th century onwards, a legal tradition, a tradition of lawyers who, little by little, tried to find ways of changing a perspective on war. I'm not going to go into another hobby horse subject of mine, which is that of the just war tradition that was practically absent in the 19th century, but rediscovered by lawyers at the end of it, and that finally made it into, to some extent, the League of Nations Covenant in 1919, where it was, the idea was that if you have a quarrel with somebody else, try to bring it to the League of Nations to sort out rather than fight each other. Only if we can't sort it, then you can go fight. But of course, very importantly, and I haven't put it in here, is the 1928 Briand-Kellogg Pact, which for the first time since it was always assumed to be a bad thing, in the 20th century outlawed law as an instrument of statecraft, and lots and lots of states signed up to it. And that idea was, of course, taken up again in the United Nations Charter. So let me just emphasize, we have both traditions in the European tradition. You may have put your hand up saying war is the norm, as saying this is what I observe, but there were indeed those people like the Moltkes and the Bernhardis and Haeckels, etc., who thought this was a jolly good thing because, of course, they thought this was going to bring them much advantage. And this is where we would have to put Putin in that tradition of the war is the norm people, where he said already in the World Economic Forum 2020, just for an example, we all know the competition and rivalry between countries in world history never stopped, does not stop, will never stop. Difference in the clash of interests are also natural for such a complicated body as human civilization. At the time, he still said, however, there are times when we can pool our efforts and cooperate. But this idea that war is the norm is clearly part of his thinking. So it's all a very relevant thing today. Then there is a third school of thought, also very much rooted in our civilization, which is that peace is actually, yes, it'll come, but in a long time, at the end. Yeah. And this we owe, of course, to our own Jewish roots, which have been taken up by Christianity, where after the day of judgment, after doomsday, you find it as Isaiah 2, that God will judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this is an idea, of course, from the Hebrew Bible, which was embraced very much by Christianity, that there is this peace only at the end of time. And, of course, by Islam. As we all know, Islam is to a large extent the bastard child of Judaism. And both of them, of course, have this missionary idea of turning the entire world into Christianity or Islam, worldwide Christendom or worldwide Islam, also with a peaceful end state only when the whole world has become Muslim or Christian in turn. And that, of course, as we all know, Marxist-Leninism is another bastard child of Judaism because it also had this idea of an end state of world communism. This idea of finality actually matches a Western idea. And sorry, all these ideas actually are very much taken from a book that Arthur mentioned. This is the Genealogy of Western Thoughts. Dr. Mazukiewicz is going to make sure that this copy goes into the library, so if you want any more of this. So on the finality again, there is also this idea, this curious idea, that we still have a very linear view of history. A lot of us still have this liberal view of history, which is that the world gets better and better and better. That should be a C, not a B, sorry. So we have this, many of us are wedded to this idea of progress, and all those of particularly my generation, who lived in the Cold War and then saw the miracle happen of 1990, 1991, where the Cold War came to an end and there was not World War III, and Eastern Europe was suddenly liberated from Soviet domination, and all of a sudden Europe was that much richer, bigger, brighter. Those of us found it very, very difficult not to see the world as a linear development of things getting better and better. Yeah? So if I had been here 35 years ago by now, for example, you would not have been using English as a conference language. Think about it. It's brilliant that you now all found that very easy. I'm just saying there's been such a change and such an enrichment for us, of course, to have you as discussants and you as partners in all this. So for us, it was incredibly difficult, and I'm talking about quite a number of me, colleagues, etc., to see this turnabout with what happened in Ukraine. You know, for us, it was something that went against the model of the world that we saw, where we thought that, well, things were getting difficult, better and better. And that is very different, of course, from a cyclical world view of history that you find particularly in Eastern civilizations, where in the Chinese world, there's a lot of the yin and yang constantly giving up to each other. But I was born and raised in Thailand, where you have the Buddhist view, which is, of course, that the wheel of life goes on and that things come back in a cyclical way, and that there's no finality in history and things just go on forever and ever. A little side note on Islam, which also preaches finality, that also sees a finality. I've already mentioned it, that for Islam, finality will be there when the world has become entirely Muslim, with the very interesting side effect that it was prohibited in Islam, or it strictly still is if you take that reading that was used in the Middle Ages and in modern times of Islam, that Islam cannot possibly form peace agreements with non-Muslim powers. Therefore, all the treaties that you had, starting with the 1535 treaty between Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire, Constantinia, and France, were always again limited in time. And it's only really that 1699 is this big turning point from which onwards historians in the West see the Ottoman Empire becoming a more Western state, because it was the first peace treaty rather than a truce between the Ottoman Empire and Western powers. And until now, you can have, the Islamists will argue that you can't possibly have peace with the West and with the Giaur, the non-faithful. Another thing that is very particular, so to come to a second way in which we presumably wrongly see war, and that is a problematic view of seeing war, that is a Western tradition, is the dualism between peace and war that also goes back all the way to antiquity. Now, this is incredibly important because it is, let me just give you the definitions. Peace is very often defined in popular dictionaries and things like that as a period, a state or a period in which there is no war or war has ended, the absence or cessation of war or hostilities, the condition or state of a nation or community in which it is not at war with another, absence of all that. And even in Aristotle, there is this dualism. We make peace, we make war so that we may have peace, but it's the idea that after war there comes peace and that is an end state. The reason why this is absolutely crucial and a big burden on us, and the greatest strength we have, paradoxically, is of course that we have different legal codes for peace and war. Now, this is one of the major acquis of Western civilization, and yet it is an enormous problem for us, as we will see, because this strict duality is not realistic. So we have the human rights versus international humanitarian law, quandary, and the laws of what the laws of war are called today. As I said, that's extremely important, and it's extremely problematic for us because we are confronting situations all the time now in which we have that strange mix. In writing about war, sort of war studies, there is also still this linear thing that I've already talked about, that we have this belief in linear development, things are getting better, which incidentally also comes out of Judaism and particularly Christianity. There's this idea, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, if you look at the development of particularly the early literature in Christendom, you have, there is this idea that there's some sort of end state, that you're working towards some sort of end state, and that this is a development towards it. Again, may I activate the audience and ask you whether you would say that war is developing in one sense, is becoming ever more brutal, ever more extensive, or do you think that it is much more up and down and much more non-linear? Could I have a show of hands of those who think that there is a development of war becoming ever more brutal and ever more large scale? One, thank you. That means you're probably all too much experts on the subject and have been tracing this too much. Or let me do the other side. Do you think that it's much more up and down and can change in many different ways? Okay, you've all read your Clausewitz, your late Clausewitz. I'm delighted to see that. Let me go to this point about that the late Dennis Showalter said, who wrote a lot about the Prussian history, etc., where he said military history is arguably the last stronghold of what historiographers call the Whig interpretation of history. The Whig interpretation of history is the one which says things are always getting better. You know, we're going from one reform to another and things are always getting better. Military history, he said, sees the development of warfare as progressive. And that's a very interesting point because it's been a subject of considerable debate. And I should insert here, and I've forgotten to do so, that our good friend Clausewitz initially thought, when he was writing on war in his early drafts of the work, thought that war was getting ever more extensive, ever more intensive, ever more large scale, because he'd seen or remembered the development from the cabinet wars of the 18th century to Napoleonic warfare, which was simply larger scale, larger armies, larger clashes, and all the rest of it. And Clausewitz wrote about that, but then in the mid-1820s, when he revised on war, he suddenly said, is that always going to be the case? And it's, you know, who actually triggered that, where warfare or where insurgencies triggered this realization on the part of Clausewitz, where that was, here in Poland. he suddenly was confronted with Polish uprisings, the last one that ended at the very end of the 1820s, where he suddenly realized that smaller scale war was still imaginable. And he actually had a whole passage where he said, we must one, actually was also, there were other things going on, a couple of other parts of the world, there was a Russo-Turkish war going on. We must wonder whether war in future will always have the same intensity that we have known from the Napoleonic Wars, or whether it can go back to earlier forms. And then he said, well, it's difficult to imagine that everything from the Napoleonic Wars will be completely forgotten, but on the other hand, he couldn't imagine that it would continue in such intensity. So very interestingly, Clausewitz himself asked himself that question quite late in life. So, on this question, so you do have a lot of literature, even after that, of people saying war is becoming ever more lethal. Particularly, you can imagine, this comes in the late 19th century, and then the time of the two world wars, ever more lethal. World war cannot be imagined unless it is nation against nation. Late 19th century thinking was all, you cannot imagine a limited war. Every war from now on will be huge national armies confronting each other in battle. Anything else is unimaginable. Then will it be larger and larger? As the world population was growing, as everything was growing, there was the assumption that wars would be ever more extensive in geography. So they would suddenly be world wars. They would no longer be just Russo-Turkish wars. They would be burning all over the world. Would they become ever more technological? This was another assumption, that more and more technology would be used. Or there was the positive hope that war would be ever more limited by international humanitarian law. People would be ever more careful to avoid killing civilians, would be ever more careful to limit themselves according to the laws of war. And this is the Clausewitz quote, after all. In recent times, he thought that war had attained its absolute force, and the question was whether it would continue to be in such monumental character. So the question was raised, and was raised, is cyclically raised by authors writing on war, whether war does evolve in a non-linear fashion, and indeed there's a sort of consensus now that it is very non-linear, that it can go back and forwards. Yes, there is more technology, but even with these recurrent patterns, there's something where you can say there are different patterns at work. So one of the big patterns that is at work, I think, or where you can say that there are two different traditions, are what I call the Achilles pattern versus the Ulysses pattern. And the Achilles pattern is to say that you rely, particularly in the West, there's this reliance on strength, on muscle, on explosive power, gunpowder, increasing all the way up to nuclear weapons. And that this overlaps with the age of machines that came from the 18th century to the present and coming more and more, so that there is that linear development where these things become more and more important. And on the other one is the Odysseus, but also you could say Sun Tzu tradition, which says, well, actually, and there's always been asymmetric warfare. There's always been groups fighting against stronger groups who had to make use of clever ways to get around the overwhelming superiority in terms of pure strength of the other side by using intelligence, by using clever ways around that. And then there is something else that I think has really come into a force since the 1960s. This is a new phenomenon. And that is, in technology in particular, the search for greater control and greater precision, which to me goes along with a change of heart, particularly in the West, of trying to avoid collateral damage and lots of civilian casualties. But it's one in which you try to do something to knock out an enemy leadership, where there's an increasing consensus that what warfare is about is changing the minds of your enemy leaders so that they will stop the war because they're in control of the entire operation. And therefore, you have to somehow get to them. But if you do, you have to find ways of getting to them that are reliable. And one early idea was, of course, today, mass bombing from the air, using nuclear weapons, things like that. But then the problem with that is the collateral damage and the damage to civilians. So that's a third tendency, but that's a fairly recent one. But let us look at the impact on warfare of technology. Does technology make it more and more intensive, more and more destructive, or what does it do? Well, I've mentioned this quest for greater precision, but of course there's now all sorts of doors opening where you think that there may be bloodless ways of manipulating things through cyber warfare. And there is artificial intelligence. What can you do with that? And what I would point out to you is that it is not the question, it's a big question mark whether these benefit exclusively very developed states or whether all sorts of people can have a go at it and actually, where you can actually find that hackers are quite cheap to pay regardless where they are, and that you can have states which in some respects are very third world, like India, having enormous potential just precisely in that area without having to invest an awful lot of money in it, because paying lots of hackers is much cheaper than developing or having very high technologies. So there is all sorts of, the development of new technology is not necessarily one that favors in a very, very massive and decisive way or in an exclusive way the very, very strong powers of this world. If you think of it, there are technologies that have always been exploited to favor the weak. And let me give you this, the photograph you find on the bottom right-hand side is the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail of the Vietnam War, where the Americans very successfully managed to intercept or bomb and do harm to North Vietnamese forces, but at the same time couldn't stop the traffic on bicycles and garden trolleys along the Ho Chi Minh Trail of materiel from the north to the south to support the communist forces fighting in the south. So there's always been, and we know the thing about drones, that the small-scale drones are really something that are pretty worrying, and how they can be used in great ways. So this out-of-the-box thinking about how you can use technology is not something completely new. And one can say that several of the new technologies that are being developed are indeed something that will favor, can favor the weak, and not just like hypersonic missiles favor the rich, or like an aircraft carrier will only be affordable by very, very few states. But think about it that also this, a lot of these will favor completely different actors, and I'll come back to this in a moment, because we're talking in this lecture conference about warring states. And I put it to you that that in itself is a box we must get out of, because we're not talking just about states, we're not talking about just state actors, and non-state actors benefit also from these new technologies. And those include, and this is I think very important, international organized crime. A subject area that I think we're still, to some extent, more protected from than people in some other parts of the world. But I had the great privilege to be in Ecuador and Peru last autumn. Ecuador should ring a bell with you, because I could now no longer travel to Ecuador. In the meantime, it has broken out into a very nasty civilian situation, with a state situation that was degraded over 5 years, with narco-trafficking and other criminal activities now dominating domestic politics, to the extent that it's not considered a safe place to travel to. So organized crime in large parts of the world is actually more important, and definitely for all of Latin America now is much more important than the concerns about interstate conflict. That is the main security concern, as the whole topic of your conferences is about security rather than just war. Now, another thing that is important for us to take on board is just how differently some other cultures see this whole question of war and limited war, major war, and things like that. You must have come across this work of the famous two colonels writing about unrestricted and beyond the limits war. Just to give you a nice quotation there, from which seems to be symptomatic for a lot of writing coming out of China today. In the postmodern, post-industrial age, warfare will not be totally dismantled. It has only re-invaded society in a more complex, more extensive, more concealed, and more subtle manner, using all means, including armed force or non-armed force, military and non-military, and lethal and non-lethal means to compel the enemy to accept one's interests. The famous Unrestricted Warfare book. And for many of our adversaries, there is not a question of simply whether they are at war or at peace. It's not at all like that. You should mix means as appropriate, and that is something that, as an idea, does go back to the 19th century. The Russian military thinker Nikolai Medem already wrote in 1836 that all great commanders were truly great because they based their actions not on pre-existing rules, but on a skillful combination of all means and circumstances. And we again have our two Chinese colonels saying, regardless of whether the war was 3,000 years ago or at the end of the 20th century, it seems that all of the victories display one common phenomenon. The winner is the one that combined well, combined different means well. And that is in stark contrast, I assure you, with a lot of experience now of teaching at a whole host of different military academies, of the way in which our military academies, at least, and I think other institutions as well, compartmentalize and categorize war. So in our teaching, there is small war, limited war, irregular war, insurgency, counterinsurgency, low-intensity conflict, operations other than war. And then on the other hand, we have whole different teaching packages for unlimited war, major war, regular war, classical war, total war, etc. And it is in total ignorance of the fact, if you just look at something like the Second World War, the Second World War had all these elements. The Second World War had the most intensive air bombardment, the most intensive battles, tank battles, Kursk, for example, and had the most intensive, and then it had lots of little resistance movements. It had lots of small-scale sabotage. So it had all these things together. It was a combination, it was a mix of all these, and yet the way it is taught in military academies is, today we do small war. Today we do major war. And those are completely, they're just so separate that for after Vietnam, in American military academies, small wars, counterinsurgency, was not taught for 2 decades. And at the moment, it's on the way out again. At the moment, it's difficult for me to shoehorn a lecture on small war into a program on strategy. So that's how, how badly we think, I'd say, or how deficient our thinking is. And even that, even though we have our military commanders coming back from expeditions, for example, the British Brigadier Ben Barry, talking about Iraq, said it was a campaign that saw many variables interacting in a constantly changing fashion. This made the two wars, Iran and Iraq, complex and non-linear, or Petraeus said, law is not a linear phenomenon, its calculus is not arithmetic, and it's like 3-dimensional chess in a dark room, said Graham Lamb. So all of these say, look, you can't simply, one, it's not linear, and 2, it's a mix of all these. It's these different things coming together. So, let me see if you're still with me. Should we define war more broadly? Hands up for anybody who thinks we should define war more broadly. I think more of you will think so possibly after I've said what I said, but at the same time, I'm cautioning you. Let me repeat that I see as one of our greatest weaknesses and one of our greatest strengths the fact that we have different bodies of law for war and for peace. And I don't see how we should get out of that or abandon it, because I think that's a very, very important distinction to make, with that very fundamental distinction that in war, certain people, you can kill certain people, in peace not. So, let me now turn to your neighbors to the east. The Russian definitions of New World War are in this context very important, because they, and this is also my little discovery, because I, with my idea of a linear development of history, with my mistaken views of a linear development of history, I thought that I, like many others, really did think that in the 1990s that a new era was dawning and we could really, really, really cooperate with the Russians. And I'm sure there were Russians who thought so as well. But if you look at the military literature produced in Russia, and Voyennoye Mysl and the other sort of military journals produced by the Russian military establishment, you found that even in the 1990s, there was a continuing great distrust of NATO and particularly the United States in that literature, despite the fact that you had the NATO-Russia agreement and all sorts of things. So even in the 1990s, there is literature that says there is new war abroad, And to some extent, those were the interpreters of what had happened in the 1980s. They would say, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union has been defeated. This is one of the things that always makes my hair stand on end when somebody from anywhere in Eastern Europe, whether this would be Eastern Germany or the Soviet or Russia, says, of course you defeated communism. Of course you defeated us and you're wallowing in this victory. To which I've always said, I don't understand how you can say this. It's not a defeat. It was a win-win situation. We did not have World War III. We're still alive. Can you not accept that? Okay. But anyway, all those who continue to say, you know, the wicked West defeated the strong Soviet Union and this is a terrible thing, were writing in the 1990s, how did the West do that? How did the West do that? And they came to the conclusion that it was through non-kinetic means. It was through economic, diplomatic, and political means, influencing populations that one sees to dominate with new ideas. And one of the favorite things that, of course, you have in Russian military literature to this day is that the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics were all of the CIA's making, that they were artificially generated and would not have happened if there hadn't been wicked CIA agents distributing money in these countries, and that the Arab Spring was entirely one of Western making. And that there was the cultural subversion, the virus of Western decadence that was being propagated through unnatural values and things like that. And of course, cyber war. So there's this whole definition of a new form of war. And of course, it's highly relevant to this day. I've just had the last translations of Vayana. I'm still, unfortunately, reading the Vayana. I'm still only in that in translation. My Russian is too poor. I had many classes, but it hasn't quite worked out. But the last version of this spring has still got articles in it, like Colonel Bartosz, who's still going strong, which continues saying this is still going on. This is going on now. This is the danger of confrontation between East and West. And of course, the Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov, just to give two examples, 2015, claimed that this color revolutions, the Arab Spring, were typical of this new warfare. And 2018, the military conflict in Syria was considered as the archetype of new warfare, new generation warfare, consists particularly of the fact that the enemies of Syria take secret actions against Syria without leaving any trace, without engaging in a direct military conflict. And I'm sure you're all aware of this, that when the Russians talk about hybrid warfare, it's what NATO does. It's not what Russia does. They attribute this to what NATO does, what the Western powers say. They're waging a hybrid war. And this is absolutely fascinating. Even this latest article in Jagiellonian by Bartosz, an intrepid writer has been saying this over and over and over. It's a fascinating article where, again, he describes all the wicked things that NATO has been doing since the 1980s, practically. And each time, if you black out the word Russia, black out the word NATO or the Anglo-Saxons, that's another one they use, and you substitute Russia, you get our reading of the situation. And this is what I call the Russian psychopathological projection, which is that they continue to say that the West does what we see the Russians as doing. So here's Bartosz, already mentioned, now retired, who says the strategy of hybrid war, which is what NATO does, aims to exhaust the victim country and employs a large span of measures. The aggressor state attacks clandestinely. An important element of the strategy of hybrid war is the deliberate impact on the state's military security sphere to exhaust itself with exorbitant defense expenditures, brackets, that's of course the 1980s story. This is the Russians' reading of what NATO did in the 1980s to defeat the Soviet Union and break up the Warsaw Pact by exhausting it in the arms race. By provoking local conflicts on its borders and strategically important regions, by holding large-scale military exercises along its borders with provocative scenarios. Where have we seen that in practice? And this is another lecture I will not inflict on you right now, but let me just summarize that this is something that the Soviets learned from the Germans in the Second World War, because in the Second World War there were two occasions where the Germans had a military exercise that prepared an invasion, thereby surprising the other side. And the most important one of those is, of course, the one that came before Barbarossa. where they then had the invasion of the Soviet Union. And from that moment onwards, the Russians used that systematically. And I believe your country has particularly had particular experience of this around the time of the Solidarność movement. You may recall, no, some of you are too young, that the military putsch in in Poland occurred because the Russians had basically said they're going to invade. And that was on the basis of the prepared invasion prepared by a military exercise along Poland's borders. Yeah? So this is something the Russians had done. They did that in Hungary in 1956. They did that in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And then they taught it to their students in the military academies. And their students in various parts of the world then used that for their own purposes, all the way up to Saddam Hussein using it against Kuwait and blinding the West to what he was going to do by having an exercise, the Egyptians doing it with the Yom Kippur War, and etc. So there are a whole series of examples, the Indians doing it in the brass tax crisis in the late 1980s. So it's a standard thing that they've taught and that their disciples went on to then do. And the interesting thing is that I cannot remember a single occasion where, since the Second World War, any of the NATO member states used a military exercise to prepare a surprise invasion of another country. But this is precisely what Bartosz is attributing to NATO and the West, okay? And then by deploying destabilizing weapon systems, that's of course the air defense, the ballistic air defense that is deployed by NATO, by using fifth columns and networks of agents, and the time frame of the strategy of exhaustion is one of several years. And I put it to you that is actually what the Russians have done in Ukraine. Yeah? So this is why I'm saying it's this bizarre psycho-projection, it's this psychopathological projection that they're actually saying that we're doing. And again, I will spare you the lecture on this, but there's a lovely, if you look at the early 1980s, through which I have wonderful access because I can read the East German files that the West Germany inherited from there. There was a whole group of military leaders in the Soviet Union, particularly, of course, in Moscow and, in fact, in East Germany, who were trying to convince everybody that there was a big conspiracy on the Western side to use the cruise and Pershing missiles, the Euro missiles that were being deployed in Europe at the time, for a surprise attack on the Warsaw Pact, which nobody planned. Yeah? And this was this big crisis of the early 1980s, and they really got themselves into this thing because they constantly said, it's this mirror imaging that they do, which is what would we do in that situation? And just a very little footnote for those of you interested in missiles and things. One of the reasons for this was that the Soviet engineers looking at the cruise and Pershing missiles and worrying about the fact that cruise particularly could fly under the Warsaw Pact radar was that they said, well, surely in that case they are designed for a surprise attack because that's how we would use them if we had them. And it is similar with the ballistic missile defense now, where I have talked to a Russian rocket engineer who said to me, well, the point is that you take those missiles, you screw on a nuclear warhead, and you've got an intermediate range ballistic missile. That's precisely what you can do, which assumes that that is what NATO wants to do, because that is what he thought of that you could do with those weapons. It's always this thing of, if we had them, this is what we would do with them, therefore the other side intends to do the same. And there's this fascinating mirror imaging that they are prone to, and the really, really difficult thing there is that we find it awfully difficult to break through that because anything we do can then be interpreted as more deception. So let's get to the end of this part. Even Mahmoud Gareev, great authority, etc., and a colleague of his called Turko, in 2017 actually argued for a redefinition of war. This is now the point that I was making with this, where he said it is urgent to introduce an amendment to the defense legislation of the Russian Federation so as to enable Russia to take measures to push back pertinent threats and, if necessary, to declare a state of war, not only in case of armed attack, this is now getting to the legal definition, right, but also of a threat to national security in the areas of economy, ideology, information. And the military doctrine and an appropriate structure of the state's military apparatus should therefore be developed. Now, the point is that the Russians, like our American friends, tend to be more interested in their own legal definitions of things rather than on international law. But that in any way shows you this whole inclination to say, well, actually NATO has provoked the war in Ukraine and we're only really in a defensive position. Let me, if I have the time, can I have a little bit more time? Or are we getting very exhausted? I have a couple more sub-points to make on this one. Okay, let me just be very, very brief. One of the parts of this redefinition of war thing is that they've actually become very keen. I don't know how many of you are interested in strategic studies, in definitions by somebody in whose tradition I stand, because my supervisor was supervised by somebody called Basil Littlehart. And Basil Littlehart is very famous for the idea of an indirect approach, that you should not aim to defeat a superior or an equal power by going for a direct clash, but trying to get them somehow indirectly. And interestingly, Littlehart is now one of the most frequently cited authors in Russian military literature, and I'll just go through that very quickly. That's Littlehart. And you have a lot of people constantly now citing this, including Gerasimov and Beatrice, etc., indirect action. Let me dwell on this one very briefly. There's a fascinating article, came out in February 2021, which is an escalation ladder, which they call, well, actually, there's the Russian use of the word that we translate as deterrence is actually much more active than, it's more coercion, strategic coercion. And they have a wonderful 8-point thing about how one can escalate, but you don't necessarily have to take these steps individually. It can be, you can start with economic, psychological, ideological, and diplomatic pressure to discredit a government of an adversarial state in the eyes of the public. Disinformation, use disinformation. Intimidation, this is an interesting one, and corruption of key officials and military officers and other members of an elite. That's an interesting one because recent scandals in the European Parliament that we're none too proud of are examples of this. Sabotage, destabilization of society, measures of key politicians and other undesirables, inciting uprisings, and the model is supposed to be this color revolution, supposedly organized by the CIA. Fifth level, blockade, closing off frontiers, sending in peacekeeping contingents. They would say that Western peacekeepers are there in order to start integrating countries into the Western sphere. Then a beginning of the military part, selective targeted missile strikes against key targets. I'm putting it to you that that's still going on to some extent in how the Russians are conducting their Ukraine war. Large-scale military invasion and lasting elimination of remaining pockets of resistance, February 2021. I wish I'd read it then. And very briefly, again on that point, and I'll skip the last bit, Clausewitz says war is the use of kinetic force. The word is kinetic, it's physical force. And he explicitly excludes non-physical force. He says political things, yeah, but war is about physical force. And there's a whole debate, I'll just tell you, there's a whole debate about this where the Russians talk about nasilia. Is it nasilia? Does it have to be nasilia? Is it more than that? I'm very happy to make the slides available to you if you want them at the end. And it's a big debate in the Russian literature. Should it include just nasilia? Should we concentrate just on nasilia, or do we actually think non-military means are very important? Does war have to include military force? And in fact, there's a whole series of people who say we should redefine war to be much larger than that. And then you have the traditionalists who said, no, it has to be just when nasilia is around, when you have physically force. And then very importantly, you had Gareev, big authority, moving from one camp to the other at the end of his life. So, and it even includes the question of what should you teach at military academies, and a lot of arguments saying we should teach more, we should teach all the non-military, non-physical things like hacking and economic warfare, all these things at military academies. Our military should actually teach this as well. Again, of interest to me because I'm teaching at a military academy as well at the moment. And again, just to sum up with a Gareev quotation, in modern strategy, means of economic, political, diplomatic, and informational pressure, and also demonstrations of military force to reinforce the effect of non-military measures are actively used. Military force is used when it is not possible to attain the defined aims by non-military means. Well, that makes it quite clear, doesn't it? So it's again this idea of war is the norm, whether it's in physical form or not. Coming to very much to the end now, state-centric definitions. And this is where I am quarreling with the war of the states, not in a bad way, just to say that in our whole heritage, and many, many pages in here, people writing about war have assumed that we're talking exclusively about wars between states. And again, I'll make this very brief by saying, in fact, in the Middle Ages, we thought differently. In the Middle Ages, we thought that it was quite legitimate to have your private feuds, and then there was interstate wars between Christian princes, but there was also wars between Christian princes and the Ottomans, the Turks, the Giaurs, the non-believers, and that those should be treated differently and had different sets of rules for them. And then it's only after in modern times, really, that the state monopolized the use of force, that this became a new thing. And then, just to spare you the detail, all of which you can find in my book, the definitions of warfare then of the 18th, 19th century were all about war is exclusively defined as the conflict between equal powers, state powers, yeah? And it was very important that they should be sovereign and independent, etc. And then, next step, a new development. It is only really in the 20th century that, in recognition of the realization of the reality that it is not always thus, and of the reality of insurgencies and the importance of insurgencies for security, you had people from Quincy Wright to Hedley Bull to Colin Gray gradually creating larger definitions, where instead of talking about war between sovereign states, they would say something like distinct but similar entities. Hedley Bull went even further and said it's actually organized violence carried on by political units. This still excludes criminal activities, criminal actions, right? Colin Gray, violence, organized violence, threatened or waged for political purposes. Yeah, always here the focus on a political program. And let me just say in this context that even that is problematic, because if you look at mafias and how they justify their own actions and existence to populations whose support they try to win, is that they create an interesting parallel narrative of how they, in fact, replace deficient states as sort of parallel or alternative state-like organizations, and that they actually are the ones who provide order, but also security to people in a curious way. So this doesn't totally understand, or it doesn't totally grasp that the activities of criminal organizations really are a problem here. And also, it's very strange because we have become, let me skip quickly, we've come from a tradition also that is, again, goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, where we see there is some sort of war that is legitimate, that is between states, whereas the internal states are particularly to be deplored, internal wars are particularly to be deplored, and therefore states will always try to criminalize insurgents as being non-legitimate participants in this, and there's a whole thing about this. It's only really in the 20th century with the Geneva Conventions that gradually this idea of war, the reason we now talk about armed conflict is to bring this in, to cover this as well. Additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions go even further. International organized crime, however, is still excluded from this. And this is both fully understandable from a legal point of view and problematic. And I'll just put it to you that the conflicts since 1990 and future conflict will increase in numbers of intestine wars. There will be a growth of international organized crime. Incidentally, the Russian authors agree on, this is one thing I agree with the Russian authors on, and that there is always an overlap between insurgents and crime because the state tends to use all its police forces, etc., to cut rebels off from legitimate ways of acquiring arms, etc., with this as a result, that we're seeing this overlap between organized crime and political non-state actors' activities. And that's something that is almost preordained by the very fact that non-state actors act against states that try to deprive them of legitimate means, etc. So we have this real problem that we have adversarial combatants there. So, example, again, we're talking about Brigadier Barry Blood saying, in Iraq, the complexity resulted from the diversity and overlap between the armed actors. You didn't just have state actors, but also unstate actors. In Iraq, from 2003 onwards, there was a great deal of overlap between militias and organized criminal groups, as well as political and religious extremists and death squads. In both wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, smuggling, blackmail, protection rackets, and organized crimes often funded malign political and military activities. Incidentally, it was also true for Yugoslavia. I was on the Yugoslav desk in NATO for a bit. So this is the reality of it. And you also have this great, many involvements now of mercenaries, where, again, it's not really covered by the international law. And this is, again, we're having difficulties with this because we have this terrible fixation with a dualism, a binary thinking of us versus them, which, well, okay, just to think this is, it's really almost who's not for me is against me is this thing that we've all grown up with. And again, this whole war amongst the people brings that. Which brings me to my conclusion. You will be relieved to hear. Very briefly, we have real conceptual problems. Warfare has not evolved in linear fashion, neither from more limited to ever more lethal, nor from terribly cruel to ever more humane. Neither is true. Binaries apply in international law, in the whole, but they are unhelpful for our conceptualization of war, our understanding of war. We tend to be too much, assume too much that we can plan for action because we tend to have superior means on the Achilles side, the confrontation side. Peace through superior firepower, as one of the American military mottos is. We see peace on the whole as the norm and want it now. And I don't think we should assume that war is or should be the norm, but others do not see peace as the norm. Others do see war and confrontation as the norm. And we have to somehow do something about that. So we have to adapt to constant or recurrent long-term grey zone strife, and we don't quite know how to do this, particularly in a legal context, because that's a problem then. How do we adapt international humanitarian law to this factor without trying to undermine the safe spaces that international humanitarian law has created? We have to adapt to the evolution within war, which can take on many forms simultaneously. It's not a box for major war and a box for insurgencies, etc. And it also brings with it the ethical problems that to uphold the international rules-based system, Western powers feel obliged, rightly so, I think, to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, as the military so often complain, in the sense that they have to, they try to uphold the rules and the norms, because that is the only way to keep the high ground on this. And the last one, and I'll leave you with this, is because it's a problem that I cannot possibly resolve here now, that we cannot possibly resolve here now, but we might be talking about this at a later stage, is the question of we don't want warfare to affect civilians, but it is an enormous and constant struggle to differentiate between innocents and combatants. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for this excellent lecture and real food for thoughts, especially when it comes to these many shades of war and peace, or the space in between, which has complicated so much in the past time, especially with the emergence of non-state actors, and also the stretching of the traditional field, which was somehow secured for the state and its armed forces. All right, so now we have time for questions and answers. So you are mostly welcome. I'm just encouraged to ask a question or a comment. And before making the question or comment, please shortly introduce yourself. I see Carlis is waiting
to. Well, that sounds good. Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor, for a wonderful presentation, wonderful lecture. It was utmost pleasure to be listening in, not necessarily a security and military expert, so for me this was even better to listen in. I'm Karlis Bukovskis, Latvian Institute of National Affairs and Jagiellonian University. I have a comment which I was hoping maybe you could comment on as well. Looking at what you presented as a Russian psychopathological projection, and I was thinking that this is absolutely coinciding with a whataboutism, what Russia is actually doing, not only in the military sphere, but in the politics and everywhere else. Since the end of the Cold War, and actually if you go back into Russia's history, you could see that this copy-pasting, adjusting, mirroring things is everywhere. Because in this case, again, they are learning from the West. They want to be like West. They cannot necessarily lead in all the aspects that they see. So they basically take this up and replicate. Replicate or actually go first with using the hybrid warfare, as you're saying, or many other things. Because again, if you look at the approach to the frozen conflicts, if you look at the recognition of states, where, how, this is basically this just, it's always the argument, look at the West. Americans, they're doing exactly the same. We're not doing anything different, right? So in this case, I wanted to, if this, you also see this as fitting into the general, and how, if it can actually be adjusted, can Russia actually become at one point, you know, because they want to emphasize and re-emphasize how special they are, how unique they are. So could they ever, looking back in history and looking at the modern politics, could they ever become something different from the West, what they are claiming they want to be? But in reality, they just continue copy-pasting and not inventing something which would be, well, unique. Thank you.
Can I answer directly, or would you like to? Okay, yeah, let me, there's a funny precedent for this, because it's slightly more complicated. It's not just the Russians learning from the West in this case, because the West learned from Russia, or from the Soviet Union. Because this whole indirect approach thing that Basil Liddell Hart worked out was to say, look what the Soviet Union is doing. They're using international communism in order to infiltrate us and do all sorts of things to us in a competition that is non-violent in the Cold War. Look, the indirect approach, that's what the Soviets are doing. And then the Russians are saying, oh, look, it's a Western thing. But in fact, what the West was doing in answer to the Soviet propaganda and all that in the 50s, 60s and onwards was learning from them, and now, and as if for somebody interested in military history, strategic history, it's a very funny parallel in that the Napoleon invented a certain type of warfare. Then Clausewitz analyzed it. Then the Prussians won the Franco-Prussian War, and then the French said, we have to learn from the Prussians, until somebody said, well, actually, the Prussians had learned from Napoleon. So actually, we are learning from ourselves. So they were terribly proud that they could now rediscover Napoleonic warfare. Okay, so there is that bizarre thing. Could the Russians ever get away from it? Well, I suppose this is a really challenging question. Because in a way it also raises the entire question about where the Russians are, what the Russians are they something separate, etc., where they emphatically, I would say, from having all Russian literature I've read, I don't buy it for a second that there is a really Oriental thing there, because otherwise they would be quoting Sun Tzu, or otherwise they would be showing that they had knowledge of Chinese literature, which in the entire 19th century they don't have, the entire 20th century they don't have, and they ignore, royally, and all their orientations always towards the West. So they are so very much part of a European Western tradition from that point of view, just as in a horrible way the Nazis were. You know, the Nazis were everything that was worst about a European tradition in the similar way. Can they ever become anything else where there's the elements, of course, of technology, bigger socioeconomic developments, and the limits of our interpretation of these, as long as we try to stay within a sort of rational, analytical approach? So as long as we don't say this is the hand of, I don't know, Kautila, sorry, this is the hand of Vishnu interfering, or this is clearly, you know, some forces of magic that are coming into it. We only have an interpretational pattern that is a Western one, which is this, you know, our understanding of economics, of societies, etc. And they are operating in the same macro culture. So I don't see how they can get away from that sort of interpretation. What's fascinating is that even within Marxist-Leninism, they would always have this realist assumption about this is what the West wants to do. What is fascinating is that they have imported that they have survived the changes of regime from Marxist-Leninism to Russian ferocious nationalism with a horrible religious sprinkling on it. But it again shows that there's no real alternative way of understanding the world economics and things like that. So we are operating within one scientific system, if you like, and as long as there isn't a parallel one, I don't see how they could get out of it ultimately. But I don't know enough about Russia truly to be speaking as an expert.
Okay, any other question, a comment?
I allow myself to use the microphone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. I really, really appreciate it. Agata Mazurkiewicz, Jagiellonian University in Kraków. And I have a question about more of the conceptual discussion around war, and I would like to ask you about your thoughts on new wars and the concept of new wars as this complex ecosystem that includes states and non-states and criminal organizations and all that combined methodology and all the tools that can be applied in order to harm other people, and also that. How does that fit into this conceptualization of war and peace? What are your thoughts about that?
For me, it's important that there is a sliding scale, if you like, that goes all the way from something which I think is very healthy, very good, and very positive, which is debate, political debate. All the way to the far end is war, and somewhere there's a cutoff line. And it is, I admit that it is difficult to see that cutoff line, but I would still think that that is a point where we're dealing with death. So whether it is death by infusing or having biological pestilence distributed or something like that by biological weapons, or whether it is death that you cause by paralyzing an entire city where lots of people die because the heating stops in the winter and they're going to freeze or something like that. I mean, the moment when death is involved, I think you're crossing a line to something which I would then define as war. And I still think that on this side of it, you know, all the nastinesses that one side can do to the other should be seen as something that does not come under the category of we have now got into a state of law where we can legitimately kill. Yeah. So I think the legal differentiation between the laws of peace and the laws of war should be upheld. We should try very hard to develop new legislation for, as we're trying to do, to deal with cyber war and things like that. We should be trying to uphold such rules, etc., and we should be dealing with sanctions and punishments and things like that in order to counter them. But I think that there's no. It is important, I think, from our side. Even if you have the rise of nasty parties, you could pronounce it almost Nazi parties. If you have the rise of nasty parties in Germany and in Italy, in the Netherlands, in France, this is not the point where you should start beating each other up, shooting each other, and having a civil war or something like that. This has to be continued to something that is a question of debate. Even if you found proof that somebody was paid for by foreign agents or something like that, I do think it is very, very important to uphold and to try to find ways of upholding the differentiation between legally war or peace. But then the fact that debate about how the world works and how these things, politics should be, goes all the way to something fairly peaceful and something that can be very civilized, is something that we can't deny. You know, I think we cannot say from this moment onwards, this is uncivilized and we have this is some domestic war, unless there is killing. And I think that is a criterion that is a simple rule of thumb to apply, so that we can continue to uphold the difference, which I think simply for the legal reasons is very important.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning for everybody. My name is Bismillah Tawan. I'm from Jagiellonian University. I have a question about the. It's maybe related to my previous questions also about the new kind of war. They're using non-state actors and proxy groups. What's going on in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and some other part of the world. What do you think? It's not can be a challenge for definition of war and peace. For example, no governments taking responsibility of these groups. And a specific example in Afghanistan in the Mujahideen times against the governments of Afghanistan and SSR in Afghanistan, and also the Taliban and other like non-state actors or proxy, we calling proxy groups in the Middle East, especially the proxy group in Iran in the Middle East. They are not a challenge for definition of war and definition of peace and the international law, especially in the responsibility kind. For example, the Wagner group is involved in the Ukraine war in some African countries, or some Hezbollah in Lebanon, or some other proxy groups or non-state groups in the war. Thank you.
On this point, I mean, first of all, very much so. This is what I was trying to. I just summarized it too briefly when I said about non-state actors. You know, I was thinking about Gaza. I was thinking about Hezbollah, etc. Those are obviously they have links with states, but they're not necessarily statehoods. They're state actors. That's precisely what's making it so much more difficult. And for example, I'm totally baffled by the way in which, of course, different applications of legal norms in that case make it possible to see something very differently. I just had a long discussion with two Israeli friends who kept telling me that because what Israel and Hamas are having is a war in their categories, they are fairly proud of what they thought was a relatively low figure of collateral damage with regard to the civilian population. As this is not something that everybody accepts, we see it as a totally disproportional number of killings of civilians in Gaza. You know, so then this bizarre, you know, you can see how the difference of how you categorize this makes absolutely all the difference in how you then continue from there on to see responsibility and culpability and all that. So yes, that is an absolutely crucial thing, and that's precisely one of those huge areas that is very difficult to see. And I think it's for international lawyers to help me there, or to help us there, because I can't see my way through the maze. There was a point in a question I had earlier, which I failed to answer, which is also the whataboutism. And I just wanted to come back to that very briefly, because you touched also on American actions in. First of all, whataboutism must be absolutely refused. I always liken it to my 17-year-old daughter at the time, who, when I told her that her room was a mess and I couldn't bear it any longer, she told me, "Yes, Mummy, but you can't cook." One should refuse that. It is not, if you accuse somebody of having done something, it is absolutely illegitimate of them to say, and 500 years ago, or even just 20 years ago, some Western government did something similar. That's not the point. The fact that somebody else has broken international law at another occasion does not make this breach of international law acceptable. Yeah. So do come back on that every time that you hear it. It is true that Western powers have done dreadful things. Yes, and I mean, there tend to be inquiries, and there tend to be, not in all countries, but there are countries that are more culpable of breaking international law than others, and there are good reasons why France and Germany in 2003 did not go along with the war against Iraq. You know, I mean, these are debates that are there and that are legitimate, but that does not mean that you can then simply say, well, because we did something, or somebody, and one of our allies did something, or two of our allies did something dreadful, this is now international norm and should be accepted as such. But just to back to the question of categorization, I find the whole, the Gaza issue is a particularly difficult one for us currently to understand the conceptualization, and a particularly difficult one if you could stick to state-centric definitions of war.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. I'm Jagiellonian. Sorry. I thank you very much for this excellently structured presentation, which then provokes the number of questions because of the usefulness of the structure that you offered. So one thing that I'm particularly keen to ask as for now is what you think about the bounties or reasons or objectives of wars in general, and the war that Putin is doing against Ukraine in particular today. So what this war is actually fought for, given the amount of cost that is being inflicted by the others on the warring party there. Given the level of interdependence, I understand the First World War reasoning that the interdependence of the 19th century didn't prevent the First World War, as it does not prevent the wars today, but nevertheless the level of cost that has been imposed on Russia is unprecedented. So I'd be keen to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
And then immediately say that you haven't so slightly got the wrong person, because the last intelligent answer to a question like that came from a Western political economist who was specializing on Russia, and I am neither of those, in the sense of I really don't know how much it has affected the Russian economy, and I've been reading very contradictory things. So one of the things, and you must be just as informed as I am on this one, but one of the things that is very strange seems to be that it has enabled Putin to get a stronger hold on the entire Russian economy, allowing a transformation, the transformation of the economy to be set it on a war footing that would not in that way have been possible in the West, that we have been struggling in democracies to come anywhere near. And that it has therefore in some ways realigned the economy's structure with priorities that Putin has. Another couple of things that I have been seeing is Western commentators who are infinitely better positioned than me to comment, saying they are worried that the sanctions haven't done anywhere near as much, have not had anywhere near as much effect on the Russian economy as we were hoping, that they are being conturned in many, many different ways, from selling fuel to India that then gets sold back to us and things like that. I really can't judge that. I would have thought, we would have all thought, I think, that all the sanctions had a great impact, but I'm waiting to see any evidence of this because I'm not well enough positioned to see it. A couple of things that I think are important are that they seem not to have affected a large proportion of the Russian population, and that therefore a large proportion of the Russian population, who are pretty badly off anyway, don't see much difference. Particularly sort of the rural population and the people who are not living in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Having said that, the St. Petersburg and Moscow people are not really drafted into the army. Apparently they're being spared largely, which means that, again, they don't experience it as much as they might do. So I'm simply diffident about your statement that it's been the most dramatic. It may be the most dramatic imposition of sanctions, but I'm not sure that the most effective imposition of sanctions that we've seen. But I just simply don't know. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that here.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation and taking us through this whole conceptual framework. My name is Alicia McGarrigle. I'm from Loughborough University, London. And I have one question. I'm not advocate for that, but I just wanted to know, because you are sitting on many different tables and you're participating in those debates. So I wanted to ask from this perspective, the aspect that critical security studies introduce, which is human security, because this aspect is very much absent in diplomacy, in policy making, among the military or politicians. And obviously the human security is extremely important, because all war-torn countries, they create traumas, psychological traumas, physical traumas, disabilities. Immediately, they impact development of the countries. They're knocking people from this Maslow hierarchy of needs, from the innovation to surviving. So that's in a whole affect development of the country, innovation of the country, disrupt economy, and disrupt the innovativeness of the country, disrupts state building of the country. So instead, having more stable countries, we're having those countries with generational traumas. And like, you know, that's, I'm asking also this question because you are from University of Glasgow. We know, like, Glasgow is a capital of Europe with the deaths, drug-related deaths, no, without reasons. This area was exposed to enormous amount of violence. Those traumas, they persist in societies for generations. They create long-term effects of war. Yet, this is very much absent from those wider debates. And just wanted to ask you if that's ever comes up, basically. And I know it's not popular, human security in policy-making state, but to what extent that comes up in those debates?
I'd say much to the contrary. It is the underlying assumption that we have in the West that war should be the exception, not the norm, that if a war happens, we want to finish it as quickly as possible, that we want to destroy as little of the human, or have as little collateral damage as possible. I mean, those are all the underlying premises, that it's a very, very bad thing and we try to get out of it. And the problem we have with that is that this is not necessarily the view of the other side or of our adversaries. One of the things that before February 2022 everybody was saying is that Putin has every interest in the conflict in Ukraine being long and extended, because the more instability there was all around Russia, the more Russia could have its fingers in every pie, the more Russia could influence all sorts of developments locally. And that the more there was actually interest in instability, whereas the Western assumption is always, we want to have stable countries, we want to have prosperous economies, you want to invest in these countries, we want everybody to have a win-win situation, economically flourish, lots of trade, etc. That precisely everything you've said is the underlying assumption, I would say, of the entire Western world. Even if some concede, as many of you did, that there is far more war than we would bargain for. I think there was a lady here still. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Cynthia Broca, Riga Strategic University. Thank you very much for your presentation and all the questions. Actually, that was, in a way, resonating in my mind. I am very much focused on Middle East affairs, and of course currently Israeli-Gaza war is something that I've been following, and you mentioned a lot international law and international rule-based order. So my question would be, taking into account our experience and Western positions towards war in Ukraine, how we are using legal instruments when we want to punish Russia or Putin about their war crimes, and in general, you know, to stand up and keep up with international legal order, and then our approach to how we are approaching and seeing and justifying the things probably in the Middle East. So this double standard criticism that the Western society currently is facing, do you see it as a future threat
for Western democracies, for our values, how we can uphold our values? Do you see any kind of parallels between war in Ukraine and war between Hamas and Israel currently? Do you see that as a threat for Western societies in the future if we want to keep up with our own values? Do you see any kind of, probably challenges in that, or something that we should do right now in order to avoid probably some very difficult conversations in the future when it comes to global South or general, international system? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's probably the last question for tonight, right? Or this afternoon. First of all, let's start with the assumption that the great majority of Western populations don't follow these things in as much detail as they should. But when it comes to how to judge the Middle East situation, I think all of Europe is tearing itself apart over this. Because one of the big acquis of European thinking is the story of the Shoah and the Holocaust, and the special support that Israel deserves for these historical reasons, and the difficulties we therefore have with this default attitude to judge what's going on in the Middle East. And for very many years, there's been a sort of default tendency to say, well, we have to side with the state of Israel, which is the homeland for the Jews and the only place where they can feel safe, etc. When all my Israeli friends say this is a delusion. If you are Jewish, you'll probably be safer in most other countries of the world. So it's a default. It's a problem that I think we're currently struggling with very much. And it's, as I said, can I just have a show of hands? Are there any international lawyers in the room? Oh yeah, okay, but that's a bit of I think this should be actually coming to that, and coming to also to the situation with Russia. I think one way forward is really to engage the Israelis and the Russians and the Chinese on issues of international law, and to say, with the Israelis, I think it would be forcefully to explain to them how we see things differently when it comes to their treatment of the Palestinians. With the Russians and the Chinese, I think there's a major project out there which is to see where they want changes in international law and say it is long overdue, and where we should look at whether this is actually justifiable or not, and whether it is, well, we can also look at whether it's in our interest or not, but I mean, one of the big debating areas seems to be sanctions. How you arrive by sanctions, given that the Russians can block the Security Council and therefore think that any sanctions that are decreed without their consent are illegitimate and illegal. So this is a cat chasing its tail. If they can block the sanctions, they're illegal. Yeah, true. But there's an area where they keep putting forward certain things, and it is worth, I think, exploring and discussing with them, even in fairly neutral, objective ways, what it is that they want, what do they see as illegal, and then to come up with as many people as possible, as many lawyers as possible, who have something sensible to say about the subject, and to see whether there are areas where it would be acceptable to make concessions and to reformulate law, because, as I have been pointing out, there are so many areas of international law, with regard to war in particular, of course, and conflict in particular, which do not capture the reality that the whole thing is not as black and white and binary as we would like to think. So how do we deal with that? There's massive need for improvement. Are there ways in which we can actually react to the demands and the views of other countries that are not part of the West in a constructive way? Do they have some points that are valid? And I think I would love to see projects on the definition of international humanitarian law, the divisions between that, how to treat grey areas, how to treat mercenaries, where mercenaries come in, and how to treat international crime, whether there are areas where one can regulate something like that as well. I think those are areas that need to be covered by international law.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up first session. If you don't have any urgent questions or some, I think Carlis has one. Just a short, please.
Thank you. No, I don't know if it's a short one, but I was wondering, the term war. there's implied glorification in that historically already, right? Because I'm sometimes wondering, war in itself is not what you were explaining, also related to mafia and how they're treating things, but it's basically a country attacking another country to get hold of its resources. It can be population, it can be oil and gas, it can be arable land, it can be whatever else is there. So basically, it is robbing. It's just a more organized and more brutal way of robbing another entity, when one entity is robbing another one. So I was wondering if, in some extent, applying the term war with all its intrinsic, conquerorship, right? Because that's one of those things. Putin sees himself as a conqueror, right? Or reconqueror. He's retaking things. We are looking back at the historical figures. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great wasn't great for his socioeconomic achievements. But
I refuse to call him that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. And so at the end, to some extent, we are replicating and again reiterating the whole glorification of war, which we actually should be using probably a different term to undermine, so that the state leaders don't want to be, among the greats who are known only and solely for their mass murders in large extent.
May I just point out that you mitigated something you said at the beginning that I didn't agree with. You said at the beginning war is all about conquering resources and robbery, and then you said reconquering. The whole tradition of the just war goes back to the idea that a war is only just if you have been wronged and if you are trying to somehow redress the wrong. And therefore, it is not sold, I don't think it is ever sold to any other country, or to any population as, let's go rob. Possibly among the Vikings, I don't think we have sources for that. But normally, it's not sold like that. It is sold as, we have been dishonored. Something bad has been done to us, injustice has been done, we have to restore justice, we have to avenge something terrible. So there's always this noble idea of avenging a wrong that is introduced, and that's really the background to the idea of how the thought has become the model has become more heroic. But I think if you went around the countries of Europe today, or the European Union today, and asked people, how do you see war? I think the great majority of people would say horrible, bad. Unfortunately, I don't think that is true necessarily outside the European Union. And this is the bit where I think we have never, despite the fact that there is many a European who goes, Alexander the Great, I think that's sort of like Batman, I don't think we still have that in a big way in our culture. I think it can be resuscitated among football fans if you really want to. But I think it is present in many other cultures. The whole macho, warlike, you're only a man if you killed an enemy type stuff, that you find in Afghanistan, among the Taliban, presumably, is still present in many other cultures where the idea of a warlike sacrifice is seen as something noble. Whereas I think the great majority of EU countries would be saying, can we find another way of doing this? Like, any other way? I do not want to send my son there. I do not want to send my husband, brother, whatever there. What a very bad idea. This is terrible, and would not buy it. So I do think it's deeply cultural, and I do think I'm more optimistic about how it's seen within the European Union, but we're not alone, and we have many other cultures around who don't see it like that, sadly, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to close this first session. So I would like to thank once more to our keynote speaker, Professor Beatrice Heuser. And the lunch break is ahead of us, so the lunch will be served in the part of the ground floor that you are already familiar with, I think. And after that, we are returning to this OLAP for the next session, which will be an expert panel. So warmly welcome to go back after lunch.